Near New Ulm, Minnesota, in the late autumn of 1878, the air held the clean, sharp edge of a promise. It was the promise of a killing cold, a winter that would test the seams of every cabin and the resolve of every soul within. It was in this atmosphere of preparation that Lars Schmidt began building the object of his community's ridicule. He wasn't raising a new wall or chinking old logs. He was building a bed out of 3,000 pounds of river stone and clay. When Lars Schmidt began hauling stones from the Cottonwood River, his neighbors thought he was merely building a foundation for a new smokehouse. But the foundation rose inside his one-room cabin, in the corner where his family slept. It took the shape of a massive waist-high platform, a solid block of masonry where a simple wooden bed frame ought to be. The site was so bizarre, so contrary to every known practice of frontier construction, that it stopped men in their tracks. One of those men was Einar Halvorsen. A Norwegian carpenter with hands as broad and calloused as oak planks, Einar had built more than half the structures in their small settlement. His knowledge was practical, earned through 2 decades of Minnesota winters. He watched Lars meticulously setting stones in a thick mortar of blue clay and sand, his face a mask of profound disbelief. "Lars," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that could command a timber frame into place. "What is this folly?" Lars Schmidt, a quiet German immigrant with more dust than gray in his hair, looked up from his work. He straightened his back, wiping a smear of clay from his brow with the back of his wrist. "It is a bed, Einar." Einar stepped closer, his boots crunching on the wood shavings outside Lars's cabin. He peered inside at the monstrous creation. It looked less like a place of rest and more like a crypt. No man sleeps on stone. Stone draws the heat from your bones. It's a box for a corpse, not a bed for a living family. He pointed a thick finger at the structure. "I've built 14 cabins in this valley. I know how to keep a family from freezing. You build a large hearth, you lay in a good supply of oak, and you feed the fire. You don't invite the frozen earth itself into your home." But Lars Schmidt wasn't building a tomb. He wasn't inviting the cold in. He was building a memory bank for heat, a battery made of stone and earth. And when the great blizzard of 1879 descended upon them, burying the landscape in a shroud of white, that foolish stone box would prove the difference between survival and despair, measured in a single, impossible number that would rewrite the rules of winter on the prairie. If you want to discover the forgotten engineering secrets that kept frontier families alive, subscribe to our channel. We uncover one of these remarkable techniques every week, proving that sometimes the oldest ideas are the most powerful. The mockery did not begin and end with Einar Halvorsen's professional disapproval. It spread through the settlement like a grass fire, fanned by the winds of conformity and fear. Lars Schmidt was an outsider, a man from the Bavarian forest who spoke with a thick accent and possessed a knowledge that had no currency here. In Germany, he had been the son of a Kachelofenbauer, a master craftsman who built the magnificent tile stoves that were the heart of every home. These were not simple iron boxes, but intricate masonry engines designed to capture and radiate heat for hours. Lars had grown up with the language of thermal mass, of flue paths and heat exchange. To him, stone and clay were not dead things. They were vessels capable of holding the ghost of a fire. But in Minnesota, this knowledge was seen as madness. Here, a fire was a visible, roaring beast in a hearth. Its power was immediate, felt on the skin. The idea of hiding the fire's work inside a block of stone was not just foreign, it felt like a rejection of common sense. The most personal criticism came from his own family. Anja Schmidt's brother Sven paid a visit, his face etched with genuine concern for his sister and her 2 small children, Lena and Emil. He stood in the cramped cabin, the stone platform dominating the space, making it feel smaller, darker. "Lars," Sven began, his tone gentle, pleading. "People are talking. The women ask Anya if you are well. They say this looks like you are preparing for a burial, not for a winter." He looked at his sister, whose hands were restlessly twisting her apron. "Anya, this is not our way. You will sleep on a block of ice. What will happen to the children?" That night, after Sven had left, the weight of the community's judgment settled upon Anya. "It is hard to be the town story, Lars," she whispered in the dim light of the lantern. Her voice was thin, stretched taut with social pressure and a wife's private fear. "They look at me with such pity. They think my husband has lost his senses to this hard country." Lars stopped his work on the platform's final clay plastering. He went to his wife and took her hands. They were rough from lye soap and garden work, but he held them as if they were fine porcelain. "Anya," he said, his voice steady and calm, "do you remember the great stove in my father's house? How we could sit by it in our shirt sleeves while the winter raged outside? How the tiles were warm to the touch even at dawn, long after the fire was out?" She nodded, a distant memory surfacing. "This is the same principle," he continued, turning her to face the stone bed. "This is not fear. This is physics. This stone will hold the memory of our evening fire all through the night. It will keep Lena and Emil warm until the morning sun. That is the only story that matters." His certainty was a comfort, a small island of conviction in a sea of doubt. She looked at the strange monument in her home, then at her husband's earnest face, and made a choice. "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish," she declared, her voice regaining its strength. It was a declaration of faith. The public ridicule was less gentle. It found its voice in Thomas Miller, a boisterous farmer who held court at the general store. Thomas was a man who trusted what he could see, and he saw a German fool building a granite coffin. Leaning against a barrel of salted fish, he addressed the assembled men waiting for the mail coach. "Heard about Lars's latest invention?" he boomed, a grin splitting his beard. "Calls it a bed. I call it Lars's hot coffin. He plans to bake his family to sleep on one side and freeze them on the other." The men chuckled. The name was cruel, but it was catchy. It stuck. From that day on, the structure was known as the hot coffin. The name carried with it a story of foolishness, a cautionary tale about the German who thought he knew better than everyone else. Even officialdom cast a skeptical eye. Mr. Davies, the county land agent, made a special trip to the Schmidt homestead. He was a man of ledgers and regulations, his world bound by straight lines and approved methods. He inspected the stone bed with a pinched expression, tapping it with his knuckles as if expecting it to crumble. "Mr. Schmidt," he said formally, consulting a small notebook, "this setup isn't in any manual I've seen. A masonry structure of this size connected to the stove flue. It represents an unassessed fire risk. The heat could crack the stones, or the flue could block. I can't officially condone this." He wasn't threatening action, not yet, but the message was clear. You are on your own. If your house burns down, don't look to the county for help. But the most damning critique remained Einar Halverson's, for it was rooted in the logic of the land. He found Lars finishing the chimney connection, a small secondary flue exiting the cabin wall just above the bed. "I have thought on this, Lars," Einar said, his skepticism having hardened into a kind of grim certainty. "Stone gets cold. In the night when your fire dies, that bed will become a thief. It will steal the warmth from your children's bodies faster than any wood frame. The fire needs to be in the room, where you can see it, where it can fight the cold air. Your heat will be trapped in that thing, wasted. You are fighting the winter with the wrong weapon." The mockery lasted for 2 months. The validation would last for 100 years. The difference wasn't subtle, it was profound. Lars Schmidt listened to it all, nodded politely, and continued to work. He trusted the logs of his cabin. He trusted the clay of the riverbank. But most of all, he trusted the physics he had learned at his father's side. What the settlers of Brown County saw was a 3,000-pound block of cold, inert stone. They didn't see the intricate serpentine engine hidden within. Lars Schmidt wasn't building a simple platform. He was constructing a highly efficient heat exchanger, a technology refined over centuries in the cold forests of Europe. The process began with the main stove, a standard cast-iron box stove common on the frontier. Its flaw, which everyone accepted as unavoidable, was its inefficiency. The moment a fire was lit, most of its heat, in the form of superheated gases and smoke, rushed straight up the 6-inch stovepipe and out into the frozen Minnesota sky. It was like trying to fill a bucket that had a large hole in the bottom. You had to pour water in constantly just to keep it from being empty. Lars's design fixed the hole. Instead of venting directly upward, he sealed the stove's rear exit and rerouted the exhaust. He constructed a new flue, 6 inches in diameter, and lined with a smooth, fired clay pipe he had painstakingly made himself. This flue did not go straight up. It went down, connecting to an inlet at the base of the stone bed. Inside the bed's massive structure was not a solid mass of stone, but a maze. Lars had built a winding serpentine channel, a horizontal chimney that snaked back and forth for a total length of nearly 20 feet. The hot exhaust from the stove was forced to make this long, slow journey through the heart of the masonry before it was finally allowed to exit through a small, secondary chimney on the outside wall. The physics were as elegant as they were simple. The smoke and gases leaving the stove were still incredibly hot, often exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. In a normal setup, that energy was lost in seconds. In Lars's system, those gases were forced into intimate, prolonged contact with the dense river stones and clay mortar. The masonry acted like a sponge, absorbing the thermal energy. The gases, having given up the vast majority of their heat, exited the secondary chimney at a much cooler temperature, sometimes as low as 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The energy that once heated the Minnesota sky was now stored deep within the 3,000-pound thermal battery sleeping in the corner of his cabin. The materials were chosen with a craftsman's precision. The river stones were dense granite and gneiss, selected for their high specific heat capacity, their ability to absorb and hold large amounts of thermal energy. The mortar was a carefully guarded family recipe, 3 parts sharp river sand to 1 part blue clay, mixed with horsehair as a binding agent to resist cracking. The final structure was plastered with a fine clay slip, giving it a smooth, almost polished surface. The platform itself measured 7 feet long by 5 feet wide, large enough for Lars, Anya, and young Emil to sleep on, with a smaller, slightly raised section for Lena. Upon this, they would place their straw-filled mattresses. One evening, as he applied the final coat of plaster, Anya watched him, her faith now fused with a deep curiosity. "You speak of it as if it were alive," she said. Lars paused, his hands covered in the slick gray clay. He looked from the stove to the bed, seeing not 2 separate objects, but one integrated system. He explained that a roaring fire in a normal hearth was a hungry, wasteful thing. It devoured wood and gave back only a fraction of its warmth to the room, while the chimney breathed out the rest. It was a fire starving for air, and it often ate the warmth of the house itself just to survive, pulling cold drafts in through every crack in the walls. He tapped the stone platform. "This changes the fire's breath," he said. "A normal chimney gives the sky all its warmth. This one gives its warmth to the stone first." He pressed his palm against the still cool surface, a gesture of profound confidence. Stone holds fire's memory long after the flame is gone. This was the reframing insight. His neighbors saw a massive cold object and assumed it would create cold. Lars saw a battery. He wasn't trying to heat the air in his cabin. An endless and inefficient task in a drafty log structure. He was creating a massive, radiant heat source. Unlike the convective heat from a stove, which rises to the ceiling and escapes, the radiant heat from the warm stone would travel in straight lines, warming any solid object it touched. The wooden walls, the floor, the furniture, and most importantly, the bodies of his sleeping family. The cost of the project was measured not in dollars, but in labor and ridicule. The materials were free, stone from the river, clay from the bank. But the cost of his time was immense, hours stolen from clearing land and preparing for winter. And the social cost, borne most heavily by Anja and the children, was a daily burden. Yet Lars persisted, driven by a certainty his neighbors could not comprehend. He knew the winter was coming. And winter was the only judge whose opinion mattered. If you're finding this story of frontier ingenuity fascinating, take a moment to like this video. It helps us reach more people who appreciate the powerful, simple solutions of the past. Your support allows us to keep digging up these incredible histories. And stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin during the worst storm in a decade was so unbelievable, it forced an entire community to admit they were wrong. The winter of 1878 arrived not as a gentle descent into cold, but as a sudden, violent siege. By January of 1879, the promise of a killing cold had been fulfilled. A polar vortex, a term they would not have known, descended from the Arctic, gripping Minnesota in its teeth. For weeks, the temperature did not rise above zero. Then, the great blizzard hit. The sky turned a milky, churning white, the wind howling like a starved wolf. The official temperature in New Ulm dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. With the wind, it felt like minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. It was a physical force that sought out every crack, every weakness, every flaw in a man's planning. For the families of the settlement, survival became a full-time occupation, a desperate battle waged around the hearth. The narrative of that storm was best told through two cabins, standing less than a quarter-mile apart. In Einar Halverson's cabin, a structure he had built with his own expert hands, a huge fire roared in the massive fieldstone fireplace. It was an impressive hearth, 4 feet wide, capable of holding logs as thick as a man's thigh. The fire was a ravenous beast, consuming seasoned oak at a terrifying rate. Einar and his wife Ingrid lived in a shrinking circle of warmth around it. The air near the flames was scorching, hot enough to make their skin feel tight and dry. But this heat was a lie. 10 feet away, on the far side of the room, a bucket of water left for the morning had frozen into a solid block of ice. The convective heat rose straight up the chimney, while the cold infiltrated from the floor and walls. They huddled together, wrapped in every quilt and buffalo robe they owned, yet they could not stop shivering. The cold was winning. Einar's woodpile, which he had proudly stacked 10 cords high in October, believing it would last until April, was melting away like snow in the sun. He made trip after trip to the woodpile, each time returning with less feeling in his fingers and toes, the wind stealing his breath. The difference wasn't marginal. It was a chasm. His neighbors burned furniture to survive. His family slept under a single quilt. In Lars Schmidt's cabin, the scene was from a different season. In the evening from 5 o'clock until 8, Lars kept a modest, steady fire in his cast-iron stove. It was not a roaring blaze, just a normal fire for cooking supper and warming the room for the evening. At 8:30 p.m., he would add 2 final logs. By 9 p.m., the fire would burn down to embers. Lars would then close the stove's damper and the fire would go out. To any of his neighbors, this was an act of insanity. Letting the fire die in such cold was a death sentence. But in Lars's cabin, the work of heating was just beginning. The stove itself began to cool, but the 3,000-pound stone bed, having absorbed the intense heat from the flue gases for 3 hours, was now fully charged. It had become a silent, gentle furnace. Lars, Anya, and little Emil slept on their straw mattress atop the main platform. The surface temperature of the clay plaster was a steady, pleasant 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone radiated a deep, penetrating warmth upwards through the mattress, warming their bodies directly. His daughter Lena slept on her adjacent section, equally warm. They slept not in layers of wool and fur, but in simple cotton nightshirts under a single quilt. The air temperature in the cabin did not drop below 62 degrees Fahrenheit all night. There were no drafts, because the stove wasn't desperately sucking in cold air to feed a fire. The profound silence of a wind-free interior was a comfort in itself. On the floor beside the bed sat their own bucket of water. By morning, a thin skim of ice might form on its surface, but the water beneath remained liquid, ready for washing. This was the proof device, the simple, undeniable test. In Einar's cabin, water froze solid 8 feet from a raging fire. In Lars's cabin, it remained liquid 10 feet from a dead one. The gut-punch detail of the storm, the moment of desperation that would haunt Einar for years, came on the 3rd night of the blizzard. His main woodpile was now just a collection of snow-dusted chips. The emergency supply he kept inside was down to a few logs. His wife, Ingrid, was weak with cold, her breathing shallow. Einar knew they might not last the night if the fire went out. His eyes scanned the room, looking for anything else that would burn. They fell upon Ingrid's rocking chair. It was carved from cherry wood, a wedding gift from her father, her most prized possession. He looked at the chair, then at his wife's pale face. He did not hesitate for long. He took his axe, and with a few grim swings, the chair that had rocked their children to sleep was reduced to kindling. Burning it bought them 2 more hours of heat. It was the act of a man at the end of his rope. Just after midnight, the breaking point arrived. A loud crack echoed through Einar's cabin, a sound like a gunshot. A fissure, born from the intense cycling of heat and cold, had split the chimney flue from top to bottom. Smoke began pouring into the room. The fire was now not a savior, but a poison. Einar had no choice. He had to douse the flames with snow. Within minutes, the cabin's temperature plunged. The last bastion of warmth was gone. The cold, which had been held at bay, now flooded the room. It was no longer a fight for comfort, but a fight for life. Einar looked at Ingrid, her face a mask of fear in the gloom. He knew they could not stay. There was only one place to go, a place he had mocked for months. He bundled Ingrid in their heaviest robes and pushed open the cabin door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The 1/4 mile to Lars Schmidt's cabin was a journey through a frozen hell. When he finally reached the door, his beard was a solid block of ice, his knuckles raw from pounding. The door opened. It was Anya. A wave of stable, silent warmth washed over Einar, so profound and enveloping it was disorienting. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a fire. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from the very floor and walls themselves. He stumbled inside, helping his shivering wife over the threshold. His eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. He saw the impossible. The stove was dark and cold, yet the room was warmer than his had been with a fire roaring. He saw Lena and Emil sleeping peacefully on the stone platform, breathing easily, their faces relaxed. They were not struggling. They were resting. Lars stood by the table, calm and awake, as if he had been expecting them. Einar, the proudest, most experienced builder in the county, looked from the sleeping children to the cold stove and then to the massive stone bed. He staggered towards it and placed a bare hand on the smooth clay surface. It was not hot. It was deeply, impossibly warm. All his theories, all his experience, all his mockery crumbled to dust in the face of that simple, physical fact. He turned to face Lars, his pride shattered by the physics he was witnessing. The cold had stripped him of everything but the raw, desperate need to understand. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at his wife, now being tended to by Anya, and finally back to the man whose wisdom he had so publicly scorned. His voice was a low, raspy whisper, barely audible above the wind, still raging outside. "I owe you an apology, Lars." The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculptural silence. Einar and Ingrid had spent the night in the Schmidt cabin, sleeping on the floor near the stone bed, sharing in a warmth that felt like a miracle. As the pale sun rose, Einar Halvorsen did not simply offer his thanks. He was a builder. He needed to understand the architecture of his own ignorance. He borrowed Lars's thermometer. He measured. The surface of the stone bed, more than 12 hours after the fire had died, still registered 84 degrees Fahrenheit. The ambient air temperature in the center of the room was a stable 62 degrees Fahrenheit. He opened the door and placed the thermometer on the snow outside. He watched the mercury plummet to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. A difference of 84 degrees, maintained by a phantom fire. He measured the thickness of the walls, the height of the platform, the diameter of the flue. He sketched the entire system in a small notebook, his hands still stiff from the cold. He was no longer a skeptic, he was a student. The vindication cascade began a week later, at the first settlement meeting held at the general store after the roads were cleared. The storm was the only topic of conversation. Men shared stories of burst pipes, lost livestock, and harrowing nights spent feeding insatiable fires. Thomas Miller, unaware of Einar's ordeal, saw Lars enter and couldn't resist a final jab. "Well, if it ain't the captain of the hot coffin," he announced loudly. "Surprised to see you didn't bake yourselves in that stone oven of yours, Lars." A few men offered weak chuckles, but the laughter died when Einar Halvorsen stepped forward. He was the most respected builder in the county, and when he spoke about construction, men listened. "The name of it is a stove bed," Einar said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. There was no anger in his tone, only the quiet authority of a man stating an undeniable fact. "And it kept my wife and me from freezing to death the night my chimney failed." Lars Schmidt was right, and he paused, meeting the eyes of every man in the room, was wrong, completely wrong. A stunned silence filled the store. The admission, coming from Einar, was more powerful than any argument Lars could have ever made. Physics had provided the proof, but Einar provided the testimony. The mockery was over. That spring, Einar Halvorsen did not take any contracts for new barns or cabins. Instead, he worked alongside Lars Schmidt. Together, they helped 3 other families retrofit their homes with stove beds before the first thaw had fully softened the ground. Einar, the master of wood, learned the secrets of stone and clay from the quiet German. By the winter of 1880, 7 more Schmidt beds, as they were now respectfully called, had been built in the settlement. The technology spread not through pamphlets or salesmen, but through the quiet adoption of a proven solution. It was a piece of old-world wisdom, a folk memory of engineering that anticipated modern principles of thermal mass heating and passive solar design by nearly a century. The story of Lars's hot coffin became a local legend, a testament to the quiet immigrant who listened to physics instead of opinion. His innovation underscored a fundamental truth of the frontier: survival was not a matter of clinging to what was familiar, but of adapting to what was effective. The winter, in its brutal impartiality, was the ultimate arbiter. It didn't care about tradition, social standing, or the volume of a man's voice. It cared only about thermodynamics. It rewarded the systems that worked and ruthlessly exposed the flaws in those that did not. In the unforgiving calculus of a Minnesota blizzard, wisdom was measured in degrees Fahrenheit. Innovation often arrives not as a complex new machine, but as a simple, powerful reordering of what is already there: stone, clay, smoke, and heat. The genius was in seeing the relationship between them in a new way, a way that turned a cabin's greatest weakness, its heat loss, into its greatest strength. The frontier didn't reward the loudest voice, only the warmest hearth. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please subscribe and share this story. And let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? We read every one. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by historical building techniques. The characters and specific events are composite creations for narrative purposes. The engineering principles of thermal mass heating are real, but any construction should adhere to modern safety codes and standards.